In one breathtaking moment, the entire political world stopped to watch. Rachel Maddow, usually the picture of calculated sharpness, was no longer measured. She was no longer in control. Her voice rose, breaking past the usual cadence of polished CABLE news commentary. She was shouting, screaming even as the cameras rolled and millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens. Headlines were already being written in real time. Maddow loses it. It's unexpected meltdown on live TV, unhinged in prime time. The stage, drenched in bright studio lights, suddenly felt less like journalism and more like a political boxing ring. And there she stood, her gestures sharp, her tone cutting, her frustration boiling over. Maddow had built a career on commanding the conversation, on silencing her opponents with wit and confidence. But on this night, something was different. Her voice carried more than arguments. It carried panic, desperation. The unmistakable sound of a powerful figure slipping. The camera cut, and there was Jasmine Crockett, silent, still, calm, while Maddow's fury filled the air. Crockett's composure filled the silence. Her eyes were steady, her posture unshaken. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. It was the kind of poise that made viewers pause, the kind of presence that seemed to whisper, "I've been through storms bigger than this one." The contrast was cinematic. One woman raging with the full weight of her platform, the other quietly radiating strength that didn't need to be shouted. Social media timelines were already buzzing. Why is Maddow yelling? Look at Crockett's face. She's not even phased. This is about to get good. The tension thickened with every passing second. Maddow's words tumbled over each other, a torrent of frustration, while Crockett waited like a coiled spring. Viewers could feel it. Something was about to break. The outrage was real, the curiosity even greater. Across living rooms, phone screens, and crowded bars, audiences leaned in, waiting to see whether the storm of Maddow's fury would crush Crockett, or whether Crockett had something waiting, something sharp enough to cut through the noise. And then, just as Maddow's voice reached its peak, Jasmine Crockett leaned toward her microphone, lips parting, eyes locked. But no one was ready for what Jasmine Crockett said next. The air that night wasn't just thick with debate, it was charged with the weight of a country on edge. Politics in America had grown raw, personal, and deeply divided. Every network segment felt like a miniature battlefield where narratives weren't just discussed, they were weaponized.
Ow.
And on this stage, with millions watching, Rachel Maddow wasn't merely hosting a conversation, she was standing guard. At the gates of mainstream political discourse, deciding who was allowed to be taken seriously and who would be dismissed as background noise, Maddow had earned that role through years of relentless commentary. To her fans, she was fearless, razor-sharp, and unafraid to dismantle hypocrisy wherever she saw it. But to her critics, she was the embodiment of elite liberal media, self-assured, insulated and wielding her influence like a gavel. That night, she wore that authority like armor, convinced she could control the flow of the moment. Enter Jasmine Crockett. To some, she was a newcomer. To others, a voice desperately needed in the halls of power. But there was no mistaking the imbalance. Crockett was stepping into hostile territory. The stage was Maddow's home turf. The network spotlight tilted heavily toward its star. Crockett was expected to play defense, to stay polite, maybe to get a word in if Maddow allowed her the space. The setup seemed rigged from the start, and yet that was precisely why the stakes were so high. For Crockett, this wasn't about a single soundbite. It was about something bigger, proving that dignity didn't need permission. The truth didn't need to be filtered through gatekeepers to matter. She represented more than just herself. She carried with her the echoes of immigrant families who fought for a seat at the table, of working-class Americans who were tired of being talked down to, of communities long overshadowed by louder, more powerful voices. Maddow may have thought she was debating a guest. Crockett knew she was standing in for thousands who had been ignored. Every raised eyebrow, every moment of composure, every ounce of restraint was her way of saying, "I belong here just as much as you do." The clash was never going to be equal. One woman had a towering reputation, a platform that stretched coast to coast, and a studio built around her presence. The other had grit, courage, and the clarity of lived experience. That imbalance is what made every word so precarious, every moment so electric. Because if Crockett stumbled, it wouldn't just be her reputation on the line. The narrative would shift. The young congresswoman outmatched, dismissed, swallowed by the media machine. But if she rose to the moment, if she managed to hold her ground, it would be undeniable proof that authority isn't measured in airtime or ratings. It's measured in truth and conviction. Audiences felt it instinctively. This wasn't just about policy or party lines or the usual back-and-forth punditry. This was about dignity clashing with condescension, about representation standing its ground against media gatekeeping. And that's why people couldn't look away. Every second of Maddow's rising fury only made the suspense sharper. Would Crockett withstand it? Would she fold? Or would she find the courage to fire back? The silence before her answer wasn't empty, it was thunderous. People knew, without even knowing how, that what came next wouldn't just decide who won a segment. It would be replayed, dissected, remembered. This wasn't just a debate. It was a battle for respect on live TV. Asterisk. For years, Rachel Maddow reigned as the undisputed queen of cable news. Her nightly monologues were crafted with the precision of courtroom arguments. Her delivery sharp enough to cut through the noise of endless pundit chatter. To her audience, she wasn't just a commentator. She was a truth-teller. The one who could expose corruption with a smirk, dismantle hypocrisy with a raised eyebrow, and corner powerful figures with relentless questioning that left no room for escape. Maddow's reputation was built on moments of confrontation. Time and again, she had faced senators, governors, and media rivals who thought they could outwit her. Time and again, she dismantled them live on air, weaving together facts, historical context, and razor-sharp sarcasm until her opponent stumbled. Clips of these takedowns circulated widely, celebrated as proof of Maddow's unmatched command. Within progressive circles, she was seen as both warrior and oracle, a woman who could hold the line against misinformation and disinformation, no matter how relentless the tide. Her dominance wasn't just in content, but in tone. Cadence was unmistakable. Deliberate pauses followed by bursts of biting commentary. The rhythm of someone who knew every word carried weight. She leaned into the camera, narrowed her gaze, and left viewers with the sense that she knew secrets no one else could uncover. It was a performance, but one reinforced by years of scholarship, research, and undeniable talent. She wasn't simply a journalist. She was a brand, a cultural force in her own right, and yet with power often comes arrogance. Over time, Maddow's mastery of the stage evolved into something harder, less flexible. Critics accused her of talking at people rather than with them, of cultivating an air of intellectual superiority. She'd become less a facilitator of dialogue and more a gatekeeper. Someone who decided whose voice mattered and whose did not. In the insulated world of primetime television, she was untouchable, her dominance unquestioned, but cracks had begun to show. The media landscape was shifting, fragmented by new voices rising through social media, podcasts, and alternative outlets. Younger audiences, impatient with lectures from ivory towers, gravitated toward authenticity over polish, toward passion over carefully rehearsed monologues. And Maddow, while still formidable, sometimes seemed caught between worlds commanding to one generation, but increasingly rigid to the next. That tension surfaced whenever Maddow faced someone who didn't play by the rules of traditional media sparring. She thrived on predictability, on opponents who fell into the trap of debating her on her terms. When her guests became rattled, she grew sharper, feeding on their discomfort. But when a challenger remained calm, when they refused to yield to her cadence, the balance shifted. Maddow's dominance depended on control, and control is fragile. In the months leading up to her clash with Jasmine Crockett, Maddow's critics had grown louder. Some accused her of losing touch with the grassroots movements she once championed. Others argued that she had become too comfortable, too insulated in her role as cable's intellectual heavyweight. The very confidence that had made her unstoppable now risked turning into hubris, a blind spot in an era where humility and authenticity were increasingly prized. And then came that night. Maddow walked onto the set with the same authority she had carried for years, certain she could manage the conversation as she always had. Her tone, her posture, her very presence signaled dominance. She was Rachel Maddow, who could possibly rattle her. She leaned into her words, interrupted when she wanted, raised her voice when she pleased. For most of her career, this strategy had worked flawlessly. But audiences could sense that the edge wasn't quite as sharp, the control not quite as secure. Her voice, rising higher than usual, betrayed something rare for Maddow: frustration. The cracks in her authority were no longer invisible. She was not the calm commander at the helm of a national conversation. She was a powerful figure struggling to keep her grip as a younger, poised opponent sat across from her, unshaken and waiting. This wasn't the Rachel Maddow. Her viewers remembered the composed intellectual dismantling her rivals with wit and precision. This was someone rattled, her dominance beginning to look less like unshakable strength and more like overconfidence crumbling under pressure. She had faced senators. She had faced governors. She had faced seasoned operatives with decades of experience. And she had defeated them all. But Maddow had never faced someone quite like Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine Crockett's rise to the national stage was anything but scripted. Unlike the polished paths of so many politicians who had their careers mapped from Ivy League classrooms to think tank internships, Crockett's journey was forged in the rough heat of activism, in the neighborhoods and streets where politics wasn't theory, it was survival. She did not start with the comfort of power. She began with the weight of injustice pressing down on her community and a conviction that silence was no longer an option. Long before she was sworn into Congress, Crockett was already fighting battles most elected officials never had to endure. She was the attorney who showed up when others walked away, taking on cases that didn't promise prestige but demanded courage. She defended protesters, stood beside families who had been silenced by the justice system, and spoke out even when it meant being ridiculed or dismissed. She knew the sting of being underestimated, of being told that she was too loud, too emotional, or not polished enough. But every insult only added to the fire in her chest. She wore those scars as fuel, proof that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her path was not without sacrifice. There were nights when she wondered if her fight was sustainable, if carrying the burden of other people's struggles would ever allow her space to breathe. Friends told her she was burning too brightly, that she was risking everything, but Crockett had no interest in comfort if comfort meant complicity. She chose the hard path, the one paved with obstacles, backlash, sleepless nights, because she believed the fight was worth it. And then, step by step, the world began to notice. Her fiery speeches in local council chambers caught attention far beyond her district. Clips of her dismantling falsehoods with a mix of passion and razor-sharp clarity began circulating online. People recognized something in her that felt rare. A voice not crafted by consultants or rehearsed in boardrooms, but a voice that carried the raw truth of lived experience. She wasn't simply speaking to people, she was speaking for them. Her eventual election to Congress was not just a victory for her. It was a victory for every person who had been told to sit down, to quiet their voice, to leave politics to the experts. Crockett walked into Washington with a fire that made colleagues either lean in with admiration or bristle with discomfort. She was unafraid of confrontation, but her fire was always rooted in purpose. She wasn't reckless. It was relentless. And through it all, what set her apart wasn't just her boldness, but her grounding. While others floated in the rarefied air of political circles, Crockett stayed rooted in the realities of the people she served. She carried the weight of immigrant families seeking dignity, of workers exhausted by economic inequality, of women who knew what it meant to be dismissed in male-dominated rooms. Her style was fiery, yet undeniably grounded, fueled by anger at injustice, but directed with discipline and vision. Of course, being that unapologetic came with consequences. Crockett was mocked, caricatured, painted by opponents as angry or unrefined. Cable pundits smirked at her directness. Political insiders whispered that she was too raw, too unfiltered for the national stage. But what they dismissed as weakness became her greatest strength.
8.
She didn't delude herself. To fit in, she doubled down on authenticity, and the people noticed. Every sneer from an elite only deepened the bond between Crockett and those who saw themselves in her. That bond gave her armor. When critics rolled their eyes, her supporters filled rooms with cheers. When she was underestimated, she turned that dismissal into her advantage, blindsiding opponents who mistook her passion for lack of discipline. Time and again, she proved that being underestimated was her superpower. She knew how to turn ridicule into momentum, how to convert condescension into fuel. So when Jasmine Crockett stepped into that studio, facing Rachel Maddow's glare and the weight of a stacked playing field, she wasn't just another politician hoping to survive. She was a woman who had been tested, mocked, and dismissed, had come out stronger every single time. Every insult from Maddow, every dismissive interruption, wasn't just noise. To Crockett, it was familiar terrain. She had fought this fight before, in countless forms, against countless opponents, and that was the secret Maddow never saw coming. While Maddow stood on the strength of her media empire, Crockett stood on the strength of resilience carved out of struggle. One was powered by a studio, the other by scars that had been turned into steel. One relied on dominance, the other on dignity. Dignity, Crockett knew, could never be screamed down. As the tension on that stage mounted, Crockett's silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She let Maddow burn herself out, let her voice rise higher and higher, all while knowing that calm carries more weight than rage. She had walked through too much fire to be rattled now, and that resilience would soon explode into the viral moment of the year. The debate floor was no longer a discussion, it was a storm. Rachel Maddow's voice filled the air with the force of a woman used to commanding the room. Her tone cut like a knife, sharp, relentless, delivered with the cadence that had made her both feared and admired in equal measure. She didn't just question Jasmine Crockett, she bulldozed over her sentences. Layered interruptions on top of interruptions, every syllable designed to reassert dominance. "You're missing the point," Maddow snapped, her hands slicing through the air like a gavel. "This isn't about feelings or slogans. It's about facts." And the fact is, she didn't finish, because she didn't need to. To Maddow, the performance itself was the point. Every interruption was a reminder. This was her turf, but Crockett didn't bite. She didn't interrupt back, didn't flinch, didn't let the tempo drag her into chaos. She simply waited, listening with an unblinking steadiness that made the silence between Maddow's words feel heavier than the words themselves. Each time Maddow cut her off, the contrast grew starker. One woman vibrating with fury, the other, rooted like stone. Viewers could feel it, the tension stretching thinner, tighter, with every passing exchange. Inside the studio, the energy fractured. A few gasps punctured the air when Maddow's voice rose past civility. Awkward laughter spilled out from some corners of the audience.
Us.
The nervous chuckles of people who weren't sure whether they were witnessing journalism or a meltdown. Producers exchanged glances, but no one dared intervene. Maddow was the star, and Crockett, she remained unshaken, letting Maddow's crescendo build and build. Each pause in Maddow's monologue was met not with rebuttal, but with silence. It was the kind of silence that makes a crowd lean in, the kind that forces people to wonder what's being held back, what's about to be unleashed. Crockett's tone wasn't passive. It was a slow tightening of the spring, a visible patience. That carried its own kind of power. Mad, unused to that kind of resistance, pushed harder. Her interruptions grew sharper. Her tone edged into scorn. She smirked, raised her eyebrows, gestured toward Crockett as if inviting the audience to join in her dismissal. "Congresswoman, you can't just walk into these conversations with talking points and expect serious people to nod along. This isn't amateur hour." The words hung in the air, dripping with condescension. And that was the moment Maddow overplayed her hand. What was meant to humiliate instead revealed desperation. The audience reacted not with laughter, not with agreement, but with an audible murmur of disapproval. Viewers at home tweeted furiously, "Did she just say that? It's not journalism, that's arrogance." For the first time, Maddow's authority wavered. Her voice, still sharp, carried a strain it hadn't before. She had crossed a line, and everyone could feel it. This was no longer a clash of ideas. It was a test of dignity, and Jasmine Crockett, silent until now, leaned ever so slightly toward her microphone. Now the cameras caught the faintest curve at the corner of her lips. Not a smile, not yet. But the quiet look of someone who knows they've been underestimated for the last time. And then Crockett leaned into the mic. Asterisk for a heartbeat, the room was suspended in silence. Rachel Maddow's last words, dripping with condescension, still echoed faintly, but all eyes had already shifted. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, hands steady, voice calm. It was the composure of someone who had weathered storms far greater than the bluster across the table. She began softly, almost disarmingly. "Rachel," she said, her tone even and deliberate, "I hear you. I really do. But what you don't seem to understand is that not everyone who steps into these conversations has been given the luxury of your platform, your protection, or your privilege." The words sliced through the air with the precision of a scalpel. Maddow blinked, just once, her face tightening as the crowd shifted. Murmur rolled through the studio like a wave. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't mirrored Maddow's aggression, yet the impact landed harder than a shout ever could. Crockett paused, letting the silence do its work. Her eyes didn't dart or waver. They locked onto Maddow's with the steadiness of a challenger who had nothing left to fear. When she continued, her voice carried a new edge, calm, sharpening into steel. "You've made a career out of talking about people like me," Crockett pressed. "But here's the difference. I am those people. I've lived the realities you reduced to sound bites. You can dismiss me as amateur hour, but I've been standing on the front lines while the cameras weren't rolling, fighting for voices you didn't think deserved the airtime. So don't mistake polish for substance, because where I come from, substance is survival." The words hung heavy. Gasps rippled through the audience. A man in the front row shook his head slowly, as if to say, "Did she really just go there?" Someone else clapped once, abruptly, before catching themselves. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing Maddow's face as it faltered for the briefest second, a twitch at the corner of her lips. A shift in her posture, the unmistakable discomfort of someone losing control of their stage. Crockett didn't stop. She leaned in further, her cadence rising now, no longer soft but burning with conviction. "You sit here and interrupt me because you think that's power, but power isn't in who can talk the loudest or who has the biggest platform. Power is in truth. And the truth is, the people I represent are sick and tired of being talked over by politicians, by pundits, by anyone who thinks their voice is the only one that matters." The room bristled with energy. The crowd's murmurs swelled into an audible hum, like a current running through the studio. Maddow adjusted in her chair, crossing her legs, uncrossing them, shifting as if to physically escape the intensity of Crockett's gaze. Her signature composure had slipped. She wasn't steering anymore, and Crockett knew it. She let the pause linger again, her silence daring Maddow to interrupt. When Maddow opened her mouth to interject, Crockett raised a single hand, slightly not aggressive, just firm enough to command the floor. The audience broke into scattered applause at the gesture alone. It was a small motion, but it spoke volumes. The gatekeeper was no longer guarding the gate. Her words came faster now, building momentum like a wave cresting toward shore. "You call me unpolished? Fine, I'll take that, 'cause unpolished means real. It means I'm not here to perform for ratings or craft narratives that fit into primetime slots. I'm here because people are tired of their lives being treated like case studies instead of human stories. They don't care if I sound like a polished anchor. They care if I fight for them." The audience erupted, gasps, cheers, even a whistle. From the back, phones shot into the air, recording, flashing, streaming the moment live. Hashtags were already being typed before the segment even ended. Maddow's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. The Queen of Cables silenced not by shouting, but by the unshakable calm of a woman who had carried real battles into a room designed for performance. Crockett leaned back slightly now, but her eyes never left Maddow's. The rhythm of her voice shifted once more from fiery to reflective, almost elegiac. "You know, people like me, we are told every day that we don't belong in rooms like this. They were too loud, too brash, too different. But maybe the real problem is that the rooms were never built for us in the first place. And that's why I won't apologize for taking up space here, because every time I sit in this chair, I'm carrying millions who've been shut out of the conversation for far too long. And we're not leaving quietly anymore. The room fell silent again, not with awkwardness this time, but with awe. Maddow shifted in her chair once more, her eyes narrowing, lips pressed tight, but the damage was done.
Crocketts!
Words had reshaped the room, tilting the axis of power away from the anchor desk and toward the newcomer who refused to bow. There was one final beat. Crockett leaned in for the last time, her voice soft again, the way it had begun. So the next time you feel the need to scream over me, remember this: volume doesn't equal victory. And history won't remember who shouted the loudest. It will remember who spoke the truth. The eruption was immediate applause, gasps, the unmistakable sound of people rising to their feet. Some clapped in stunned admiration, others shook, their heads in disbelief, but no one looked away. Maddow sat frozen, her lips pressed in a thin line, eyes darting toward the camera as if searching for an escape hatch. For once, she had no clever retort, no cutting remark. The camera zoomed in, capturing the image that would define the night: Crockett, steady and defiant, framed by the stunned silence of her opponent and the thunderous reaction of a crowd that knew they had witnessed something rare. The beat held for a moment longer before the screen cut to commercial. But by then, it didn't matter. The cameras in the crowd had already captured it. The clips were already uploading. The moment the clip hit Twitter, the internet went into meltdown. The commercial break hadn't even ended before the internet detonated. The clip of JasmineCrockett's.com devastating clapback began spreading across Twitter like wildfire, retweeted thousands of times in minutes. Within an hour, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag MADDOW meltdown. Hashtag truth over volume. Memes flooded the timeline, split screens of Maddow screaming contrasted with Crockett's serene, unbothered expression. One viral post captioned it simply, "This is what grace under fire looks like." Instagram Reels and TikToks were quick to follow. Young creators lip-synced Crockett's lines, reenacting the mic drop with dramatic flair. Edits paired her words with booming cinematic music, as if the moment belonged on a movie trailer. On Facebook, community groups shared the clip with commentary like, "This is why we fight for representation, because dignity can silence arrogance." The moment had transcended politics. It was a cultural event. Influencers jumped in, adding their voices to the storm. Prominent activist tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just taught a masterclass in composure. This is what leadership looks like." A pop star reposted the clip on Instagram stories, writing, "She ate. Left no crumbs." Even athletes weighed in, calling Crockett's words a championship-level takedown. Every corner of the cultural landscape seemed to claim the moment as their own. Meanwhile, the political world scrambled to keep up. Progressive figures hailed Crockett as a rising star, praising her not just for what she said, but for how she said it. Poise and power. That's how you handle condescension. One congresswoman wrote, "Commentators on the left called it a generational moment, a passing of the torch from an older style of media, gatekeeping to a new era of unfiltered authenticity." But Maddow's allies had a harder task. Think pieces began appearing within hours, attempting to reframe the exchange. Sfame argued Maddow was passionate rather than unhinged, that her intensity had been mischaracterized by social media. Others blamed the editing of viral clips, claiming context was missing. But those defenses rang hollow when the full segment aired, and viewers saw the imbalance for themselves. What was once Maddow's strength, her sharp dominance, now looked brittle, forced, almost desperate. Late-night comedians seized the opportunity. One host played the clip of Maddow's interruption, followed by Crockett's calm rebuttal, pausing mid-segment to sip water for comedic effect. The host quipped, "I haven't seen someone lose their cool this badly since my uncle tried to argue with a teenager about TikTok." The audience roared. Another show ran a sketch with an actor impersonating Maddow screaming into a megaphone, only to be silenced by an actress playing Crockett holding up one hand by the next. Mourning, Mainstream outlets had no choice but to cover it. Headlines blared. Crockett shakes up cable news with viral moment. Maddow faces backlash after heated exchange. New voice of the left emerges. On morning talk shows, pundits debated whether the incident signaled a larger shift. In media culture, some suggested Maddow's brand of dominance was outdated, a relic of the old cable era. Others claimed Crockett had tapped into something deeper, the hunger for authenticity, for voices unafraid to challenge the gatekeepers head-on. And yet, amid the chaos, one truth stood out. People weren't just reacting to a soundbite. Were responding to a feeling. Crockett had embodied dignity in the face of arrogance, calm in the face of fury. Her silence before speaking had spoken volumes. Her words had landed like thunder, and the resonance was unmistakable. She wasn't just trending, she was being embraced as a symbol. But as the social media storm raged, the story didn't end. While Maddow's team retreated, issuing carefully worded statements about spirited debate, Crockett did not disappear into the background. She leaned into the moment, amplifying the message beyond the clip itself. For her, this wasn't about 15 minutes of viral fame. It was about proving a point that couldn't be ignored, because Crockett knew what the headlines didn't. One viral clapback could light the spark, but only sustained truth could fan the flames. And she was just getting started. But what Crockett did next proved this wasn't just a one-off. Asterisk, when the dust settled, Jasmine Crockett refused to let the viral frenzy be reduced to just a spectacle. She didn't bask in the memes or simply ride the wave of internet fame. Instead, she reframed the entire exchange into something larger. Something that resonated far beyond a single night on television. For her, it wasn't about Maddow or even about a debate. It was about what happens when dignity confronts condescension, refuses to back down. Standing before a crowd at a community event just days later, Crockett addressed the moment directly. She spoke with the same calm conviction that had silenced Maddow on air, but this time, her words carried the weight of reflection. This was never about shouting the loudest, she said. It was about showing that truth when spoken with. Clarity doesn't need to scream to be heard. Her voice drew applause not just for the sentiment, but for the clarity with which she distilled the clash into a moral lesson. She pointed out what millions had already felt, that her composure wasn't just a personal trait, but a reflection of the communities she represented. People who had been talked over, dismissed, or ridiculed for daring to speak truth to power saw themselves in her poise. We know what it feels like to be interrupted, to be told our voices don't matter. But we also know that no amount of arrogance can silence the truth we carry, she told the audience, her words echoing through the hall. In that moment, Crockett turned the clapback into a parable. It wasn't simply a politician besting a pundit. It was the eternal clash between elitism and representation, between those who assume they own the conversation and those who demand a seat at the table. Maddow's raised voice symbolized an old order where power came from control and dominance. Crockett's calm response represented something new, an insistence that true power comes from authenticity, resilience, and respect. She closed her speech with a reflection on democracy itself. Our system is fragile if we forget who it belongs to. It doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It doesn't belong to the ones with the biggest platform. It belongs to the people. It's every immigrant child, every working family, every overlooked voice that refuses to be silenced. The audience erupted, not just in applause, but in recognition. It was more than inspiration. It was validation. For so long, many had watched leaders, pundits, and commentators treat politics like theater, where dominance equaled truth. Crockett shattered that illusion. Her viral moment was a reminder that democracy at its best isn't about spectacle, but about substance. It's about truth cutting through arrogance, dignity standing taller than insult. The story of her clash with Maddow began as a media headline, but it was already transforming into a symbol. Students were quoting her in classrooms, activists were playing the clip at rallies, and community leaders were holding her up as proof that resilience doesn't just survive in hostile spaces. It can triumph. And as Crockett herself reminded everyone, the power of that night wasn't hers alone. It belonged to every person who had ever stayed calm under pressure, who had ever been underestimated, who had ever been interrupted, yet still found the courage to finish their sentence. Wasn't just a clapback. It was a lesson, a reminder. Torch passed to a generation tired of arrogance masquerading as authority, and that's why this clapback will be remembered for years to come. Asterisk. Rachel Maddow may have entered that night with the confidence of a seasoned media titan, but it was Jasmine Crockett's clapback that rewrote the script. What began as a clash of voices became something far greater, a viral moment that didn't just dominate timelines, but carved its place in political history. Millions didn't share the clip simply for the drama. They shared it because it reminded them of something deeper, the power of dignity in the face of condescension, and the courage it takes to speak truth to power when every force seems stacked against you. This wasn't just Crockett winning an argument. It was a declaration that voices grounded in truth and lived experience cannot be drowned out, no matter how loud the interruption. It was proof that arrogance eventually falters when confronted with resilience. And in that silence, after Crockett's words landed, viewers heard something louder than any shout: respect being demanded and earned. But this story doesn't end here, because every time someone like Jasmine Crockett steps up, it reminds us that democracy only works when people refuse to be silenced. And if her moment taught us anything, it's that the fight for dignity, for representation, for truth is far from over. So here's where you come in. If you believe voices like Crockett's deserve to be amplified, if you believe dignity should never bow to arrogance, then don't just watch, take part. Hit subscribe, share this video, and make sure her message echoes far beyond this moment. Because the more we spread these voices, the stronger they become. The battle for respect is still unfolding. Together, we make sure it's heard.